Evening, everyone, and welcome to my interview with Father David Couturier, who's an OFM Capuchin. I'm so delighted to have Father David with us. He is an associate professor of theology and the executive director of the Franciscan Institute at St. Bonaventure University. And we're going to have a conversation about Franciscans and care for those who are experiencing poverty. Welcome, Father David. So happy to have you with us. And I wanted to start by sort of going back to the beginning. Tell us, how did St. Francis and St. Clare come to resign their wealth and their social standing and adopt voluntary poverty as part of living the gospel? Did they do that simply? Was it simply a natural decision to live a religious lifestyle, or was there more to it than that?
It was certainly a religious moment for both of them, but in very different ways, but with a lot more than just a religious lifestyle question. For Francis, it was his disillusionment with his life, his world. He had been a soldier, he had been in retail, he had been in business. All of that was collapsing around him. He had come home from a very brutal war and a year spent in prison. And he came back physically disabled. A recent book on his disabilities indicate that he was disabled for the rest of his life. He was struggling with physical illnesses of major sorts, and he wanted off the social grid. He was so disillusioned by war, by greed, that he was having a physical and a spiritual breakdown, I think. And so he was looking for God to somehow show him the path that he had to follow. For Clare, remember, she's 12 years younger, and she'd been listening to Francis preaching outside her family castle window for years. She was already well known as a very holy and very charitable young woman. And it wasn't a religious lifestyle that she wanted. She wanted to be a follower of Francis in the totality of what Francis was doing. So it was driven by tremendous religious zeal on both of their parts, but it had a specific dimension to it that had to do with poverty.
And so then, once Francis and Clare made that shift, I mean, they relinquished their wealth, they stepped outside their social classes. How did that change their relationship with those who were impoverished living in and around Assisi?
Well, for Francis, poverty was not so much an ascetical ideal. For him, poverty was the way to guarantee and secure the relationship of the brothers. So by the time this all gets sorted out, Francis comes to the realization that when God gave me brothers, nobody had to tell me what I needed to do. He had at first thought he was going to be a hermit for the rest of his life, a solitary figure in pilgrimage to God through his poverty, chastity, etc. But now he had brothers, and he began to realize that he was being called to develop a new kind of society, one that was inclusive of all creation and inclusive of all those who were excluded from society, the poor, the vulnerable.
And so now, moving ahead, as you're speaking, Father David, now Francis now has brothers and so forth, and eventually Clare has sisters. What did care for the poor mean for the early Franciscans, whether we're speaking about during the lifetimes of Francis and Clare or afterwards?
For Francis, for Francis, it was direct contact, but it was, as he says, the Lord taught him how to do mercy, not just for the poor, but with the poor. So he was identifying now with the lepers. He was now among them and with them, which is a major transformation. The early sources tell us that Francis couldn't go within 2 miles of a hospice, a leper hospice, if you will, without putting his fingers to his nose and letting the rest of the world know how disgusted he was by those who were lepers. And so Francis's conversion is the conversion to eradicating the distance between himself and the leper, a distance that was sociological, that was religious. There was a ritual during the time of Francis where the bishop, if you were known to have leprosy, the bishop would put you through a ritual, bless you, and send you down the hill, never to come back to civilization again. But Francis breaks that distance and encounters the leper by a lifestyle with them. For Clare, she's enclosed, she's cloistered. However, she uses the skills that she has as an herbalist to do a ministry of curing and healing. She was known to be someone that the people could go to if there was, if they were experiencing physical problems. There's one lovely story I love. A mother drags her kid, a little kid who, as only kids can do, got a rock stuck up his nose, and she couldn't get it out. So she brings the child to Clare, and because Clare was known to be a healer. I love that story.
Yeah, that's a wonderful one. So, all right, let's think about this now in terms of us today as Franciscans, as Franciscan-hearted people. I was privileged to be at an address you gave last year, Father David, to the National Gathering of Secular Franciscans. And I want to quote you to you, something you said. You said, quote, "The Franciscan vocation is not an escape from the evils of mortality or the temptations of the flesh. It's a flight into the relational space of everywhere, where only domination and deprivation are excluded." So what does it mean to exclude domination and deprivation? What did you mean by that? And what does this signify regarding the relationship between Franciscans and the poor now in our times?
First of all, that gathering in Arizona was amazing. I was expecting maybe a few hundred people. When I walked into the ballroom, there were 647 secular Franciscans, and it was just a wonderful opportunity. Francis did not go into the forest, into the Umbrian Valley, simply to escape from the evils of life. He could have done that by going to a Benedictine monastery. His flight was into everywhere, to be available, to be one and interdependent with all of creation, and to be interdependent with all men and women, to break down all those barriers, all those points of distance. And so for us today, it means, are we allowing ourselves to be available and vulnerable to those who continue to be excluded from the gifts of creation? Can we break down the distances that our society, our culture, our economics create today? For the last few days, 4 days, I have been working with Dr. Rod Hewlett, who wrote a book, and Franciscan Institute Publications, of which I'm the publisher. We published that book on the virtuous economy. So we're working to develop a new kind of economics that is not so exclusive of men and women who don't, one of the things that we know today is that 10% of the world's of the upper class who have the most money own 74% of the wealth, leaving the rest of humanity to share in 25% of the wealth. We can't continue with that kind of inequality. It's unfair and it's unjust, and it means that poverty just increases. There's no way out. So we have to find a way. This is what the popes have been telling us for the last 100 years, that we have to find a new way to go about caring for our brothers and sisters. And for me, that means two things. One, it means charity. We have to, meet the immediate needs of our brothers and sisters. And so many Franciscans around the world do that. In food banks and shelters and in direct service and rolling down the window to give somebody on the curb some money. But it also means for us to do some advocacy and justice work. It's not just enough to heal the consequences of poverty. We also have to heal the things that make poverty happen and what sustains poverty in our world today.
Well, thank you. I really would, I'd like to explore that a little bit more, Father David, because you've written extensively, and as you mentioned, you're encouraging and publishing the work of others on Franciscan economics and a different way to look at things. And I was thinking, if one wants to address poverty, we need to define terms. What are we talking about? Is this just a temporary condition that people fall into for a short time, or is it something deeper and more endemic? In your book, Franciscans and Their Finances, you defined poverty as, quote, a series of deprivations that accumulate in people's lives and then reinforce one another. And in another place, you comment that, quote, poverty is a reality that we structure and which we tolerate. So could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? And then what does that mean for the kinds of service and advocacy that we need to do?
Well, truth be told, those words may be mine, but the thought behind them come from modern economists who tell us that poverty is a structure. It's what we allow to happen. It's material want. It's a lack of basic necessities. It's failed economic institutions. It's gender inequalities. We know that, for example, that women and children fall faster and deeper into poverty than men do. There's loss of personal voice and agency. So it's a series of deprivations that build on one another and then kind of structure people into a life of poverty from which they cannot get out. So poverty is what we call a structural disorder of opportunity, of empowerment, and of security. So in order to begin to eradicate poverty, we have to give people opportunity. We have to give people means of empowerment. So we do that in the Franciscan world. We do that by microfinancing, helping, the fastest way for a poor person in places of Africa, for example, is to empower women, to give them the ability to have a job. And they will not only build up their families, we know that they will also build up their society. And to build the security that people need you can't have a failed institution. You can't have a corrupt judicial system. You can't have police on the take. So doing all of those things will secure the ability. Now, people are vulnerable to falling into dangerous and difficult times. You have a flood, you have a hurricane, you have a drought. But what we're talking about are the kinds of things that we can do to mitigate all of that. And it's a matter of priority. It's a matter of the choices we make. It's about how we see the world. Is it okay that the top 10% own 70% of the wealth? Is that okay? Is that the way that we want to structure our lives? Is that the way we want to proceed into the future? Because we then all get stuck in our class, in our economic class. So it's a realignment of one's horizon of power and responsibility. And what we can do, what Francis and Claire teach us to do is, or motivate us to do, is to look at our own situation and begin to make new kinds of choices about how we're going to be consumers. One of the papers that I wrote for Franciscan Action Network many years ago was Franciscans as consumers. We don't tend, those of us who take the 3 vows don't tend to think of ourselves as consumers, but we are. We spend money on furniture, on food, on cars, on insurance, and all those kinds of things. We just don't think that we have that kind of agency, but we have choices to make, as we all do. And so how do we make those choices based on the gospel, on what would Jesus have us do? And, we have more power as Catholics and Franciscans, who are both Catholic, Protestant, Methodists. We have them all. We have power to do things differently. And what excites me right now is today we have the tools to do that. And I think we also have a great will, many of us, to do that. I see a great example of it. When I was president of Franciscans International, and when I helped with Franciscan Action Network, I saw it all the time.
Father David, one of the things we also have nowadays is we have a lot of inspiration from Pope Francis to be taking the sort of steps that you're mentioning. And in your address to the secular Franciscans last year, you were saying that, and here I'm quoting you again, Pope Francis advises us that for our spiritual health, both as individuals and as nations, we must develop a new encounter with the poor. It's not enough to provide charity or grudgingly pay taxes. It's not even enough to practice justice. What Pope Francis calls for is a caring encounter. And you said further that we need to help the world transition from its market-driven obsessions with profit and power and take up the challenge of caring encounters. So I'd like to ask you, what does it mean for us to encounter the poor? And what is the relationship between the kind of encounters we might have on an individual basis and how that might connect with actions that we would take on service, justice issues, or other matters? Or that you were talking about the decisions we make as consumers.
Yeah, Pope Francis, gets me every time. He has all of these wonderful things to say about poverty and caring and all of that, but he's very insistent that when we do care, that we're very personal in the way that we do it. He said, for example, if you're giving money to the poor on the street, hold their hand, look them in the eye. Remember, this is not a poverty case. This is not social work that we are doing. This is Christian loving care. And so one of the things that I've learned over the last few years, I've been reading a lot of the work of Joan Tronto, who teaches at the University of Minnesota. She's a professor of political science, and she talks about caring and how we devalue care. Anybody who has a parent that they're caring for, or a child that they're caring for, knows how isolating that experience can be. That caring is what society tells you to do on your free time, like you have a lot. It's the extra. And we need to be more of a caring country. We have to learn how to care and what it takes to care. So she gives 5 different levels of caring. Caring about, being able to pay attention to people's needs, caring for them, assuming responsibilities. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to talk to somebody who you're just trying to find an answer to a question, and they're not listening to you. They're not caring about you. You're just a vague person in the distance. So what we're talking about here is, can we as caring people help one another to care for one another and to value that, and then to elect people who are going to spend our tax money in helping us to care, not for boondoggles and not for all this other defense spending is a great thing, and we should have defense spending. But I'd like to see a little more tipped on the side of care spending, because I think more and more of our parents and our friends are dealing with caring for their children, caring for their elderly parents, caring for somebody who's addicted, and we should have priorities for that as well.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for raising that topic of encounter that I know Pope Francis does all the time, because I really think it can shape and change the actions that we would take on all those other levels once we're in relationship with people. And
let me give you one quick example. There is a professor of spirituality at Franciscan School of Theology, Darlene Prides, who volunteers time once a week to go to the nursing home, to a hospice, and to sit with those who are most in need. And she has the incredible ability to encounter the individual where they're at, not to come with an agenda, not to come with a script, but to meet them. And it is amazing. It's just a powerful example. I'm encouraging her to write all this up so we can share it with one another.
Yeah. Father David, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for helping us as we delve a little deeper in, the spiritual basis of Franciscan care for the poor. Thank you.
Thank you for all that you're doing and for all the great work that FAN does. Thank you very much.